We begin today, though, with the conviction of former R&B singer R. Kelly.
The Grammy Award-winning artist was found guilty on all counts in a federal court in New York yesterday. It's the culmination of decades of abuse allegations from dozens of victims. R. Kelly was facing a laundry list of charges, one count of racketeering with 14 underlying acts, including the sexual exploitation of children, kidnapping, and forced labor. He was also charged with 8 violations of the anti-sex trafficking law known as the Mann Act. Prosecutors say the verdict sends a powerful message.
Today's guilty verdict forever brands R. Kelly as a predator who used his fame and fortune to prey on the young, the vulnerable, and the voiceless for his own sexual gratification. A predator who used his inner circle to ensnare underage girls and young men and women for decades in a sordid web of sex abuse, exploitation, and humiliation. To the victims in this case, your voices were heard and justice was finally served.
The verdict comes after a chilling 6-week trial with prosecutors outlining a system to recruit victims for sex led by the singer and supported by his entourage. R. Kelly now awaits sentencing in this case, as well as separate trials on similar charges in Illinois and in Minnesota. NBC News correspondent Ron Allen joins us now from outside the courthouse in Brooklyn, New York, with more. So, Ron, first of all, what's next for R. Kelly? How many years is he facing, and when will he be sentenced?
What's next is that he remains in prison, and he will probably be in prison for the rest of his life. He faces up to life in prison. If you add up all the counts, it's like 120 years or so. And my guess is that the prosecutors are going to go for the maximum sentence. Sentencing is set for May, and it's unclear right now whether those other cases in Chicago and in Minnesota will move forward or whether they will wait until after sentencing. But the bottom line is that he's probably going to be in prison and in court for the rest of his life. Joe?
So, Ron, the jury did not deliberate for long. What was it like inside the courtroom when the verdict came down, and how did R. Kelly respond to the verdict?
The jury took about 9 hours, which is relatively quick, given that this was a 6-week trial and there were 45 witnesses and a lot of exhibits. And it was also a fairly complicated jury sheet that they had to go through, verdict sheet. They had to make a number of decisions because of those 14 underlying criminal charges that were there. He was motionless. He was masked. We were in a room where we could only see a video feed of the proceedings because of COVID safety protocols that the judge was enforcing. Afterwards, his defense attorneys said that there were inconsistencies in what the witnesses had said. They had basically said that all these women were lying. Obviously, the jury did not believe that. Kelly was stoic. But again, because this verdict came back so fast, there was little doubt that it was going to be guilty. And again, when you sat through and heard the testimony of these women, it was just so horrific, so emotional, so hard to listen to in so many cases that you just felt that the jury had to believe what they were saying. And if they did, they would convict him. And that's exactly what happened very quickly. Joe?
I mean, Ron, this was not an easy trial for many of those victims. Some of them faced backlash for reporting the abuse and for testifying in court. What are they saying now that he's been convicted? What's their reaction?
There's a woman named Geronda Pace who was the first woman to testify. She encountered R. Kelly, like so many others, when she was 16. She was actually something of a fan, attending court proceedings that he was going through back in Chicago many years ago. She posted on Instagram simply, "Today, my voice was heard." And that's essentially what all of the survivors are saying, and their attorneys and their advocates, because for so many decades, they were not heard. And this jury did hear what they had to say. And that's the reaction that we're getting. There's a lot of commentary about how this was a really important case because so many of these women, the survivors, accusers, were young black women from Chicago and across the country. And there was a question of whether the Me Too culture would extend to this particular group of people, whether their voices would be heard as well. And they were. And that's what a lot of folks are saying is really significant about this. Many of them will make victim impact statements that will be read at Kelly's sentencing whenever that happens back in May. So the hope is that this is the beginning, or the continuation, I should say, of a movement that more women and men, other survivors will come forward. But it was really a huge moment because R. Kelly, the former king of R&B, seemed invincible, seemed untouchable. He certainly thought he was, but obviously he was not. Joe?
Ron Allen. Ron, thanks so much.
And joining us now to break down those charges is NBC News legal analyst Tali Farhadian-Weinstein. Tali, good morning. Thanks for being here. So R. Kelly was found guilty on 1 count of racketeering with 14 underlying acts and 8 counts of Mann Act violations. That's what these were all called. So just kind of walk us through these charges. Tell us exactly what these mean.
Yeah, so the first and the major count, as you said, Savannah, is racketeering, or RICO for short. And this is really the case that demonstrates RICO meeting Me Too. This is an old statute that prosecutors generally, though not always, have used to bring accountability, to bring justice in mob cases, so organized crime cases, to show that over time there's been a criminal organization whose purpose has been to engage in illegal activity. And that's what prosecutors proved here, that R. Kelly's business was not just a business whose goal was to promote his music and to promote his brand, but it was also a criminal enterprise for the sexual exploitation of young women and girls and boys. And it's such a powerful statute because it allows prosecutors to bring in evidence about the illegal activity of an organization over years, including crimes that may have been past the statute of limitations if they were charged individually.
And now, Tali, this isn't the only trial that the R&B star will face. He's been charged for similar crimes in Illinois and Minnesota. So does a guilty verdict, in this federal trial in New York impact those proceedings?
Well, it certainly does not preclude any of those other cases from going forward. And in each of those cases, the prosecutors are going to have to make their own decisions about whether it makes sense for them to keep going. He is facing child pornography trials in a federal court in Chicago. That case was actually slated to start, I believe, last week, obviously delayed until this one concludes. And then he's also looking at state charges, both in Illinois and in Minnesota.
And Tali, as we just heard from Ron, R. Kelly will be sentenced in May of next year. That's the plan. What happens until then?
Yeah, so R. Kelly has already been in jail for years awaiting this trial because a judge had found at the outset that he was a flight risk. And also there were concerns about tampering with witnesses and obstructing them from testifying. Now, of course, that he is facing all of this prison time, all the more reason why he will continue to stay in jail until his sentencing happens.
All right, Tali, thank you so much for your expertise this morning.
Turning now to COVID and the rollout of booster shots across the country. Yesterday, the president received his 3rd Pfizer shot just days after the CDC recommended them for certain at-risk populations, including those over the age of 65. But some states are reporting long lines and confusion over who is eligible. For more on that, we're joined by NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli. Mike, good morning to you. So the president got his booster shot in the White House live on TV. He is, of course, well over the age of 65. Why did he feel it was important to do this publicly?
Well, Joe, vaccine hesitancy is still a very real concern in this country, and especially so now about the booster shots, whether they're safe, whether they're effective, and whether they're even necessary. So the president was sending that message very clearly that it is important to do this, especially for people, as he joked, unfortunately admitting he was over the age of 65 yesterday, to do what he did yesterday. And remember, Joe, Donald Trump never got the vaccine in public. And when Joe Biden got the first 2 doses of the vaccine, he was the president-elect, not the sitting president. So a little bit of a moment of history yesterday to see the sitting occupant of the White House getting that vaccine shot. And here is the president talking about why this is so important and the role of mandates as well. Take a listen.
Over 77% of adults have gotten at least 1 shot. About 23% haven't gotten any shots. And that distinct minority is causing an awful lot of us, an awful lot of damage for the rest of the country. This is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. That's why I'm moving forward with vaccination requirements wherever I can.
And Joe, it wasn't just the president getting his vaccine booster shot yesterday. The First Lady, we're told, also got hers in private. She was teaching during the day. But also Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, the Republican senator from Kentucky, he said he got his shot yesterday, an important message to show that this shouldn't be a political issue.
Yeah, he put out a key message about the importance of vaccines. Now, as we mentioned, though, there is still a lot of confusion over who is eligible for the third shot. How is the White House trying to address that concern?
Yeah, the White House has been quite defensive about this, especially given the debates we saw in the FDA advisory panel, the CDC advisory panel, and the final decision from the CDC director to move ahead with this. What we saw yesterday in the White House briefing room was Jen Psaki with a screen behind her laying out very clearly who the qualifications are. She said there shouldn't be confusion. It's quite simple. But two issues of concern moving forward. One, Joe, you probably have heard the same thing I've heard. A number of people who technically don't qualify, who say they've been able to go into a pharmacy, go somewhere and get that booster shot anyway. And then what did we see in the initial rollout of vaccines nationwide? Each state also set their own criteria, and a lot of states haven't quite done that yet. So within the country, there's still a lot of questions about it, but ultimately people are making their own decisions here, Joe.
Now, the president was also asked about criticism from abroad, especially from the World Health Organization, saying the U.S. should pause its booster drive until countries with lower vaccination rates can catch up. How did President Biden respond to that? Does the White House believe we have enough shots to do both right now?
Well, Joe, my favorite thing about this question is the question was asked literally as the president was getting that shot in his arm. Quite a little moment yesterday in the White House. And the president once again repeated that the U.S. has done more than its fair share to make sure that vaccines are available to the rest of the world. He said 1.1 billion doses have been made available through the COVAX program. That's the UN-run vaccination sharing program. And he also made it clear that even as we have sufficient supply here, we will continue to be, as he put it, the arsenal of vaccinations for the world. And unlike countries like China, we're doing this free. We're not expecting anything in return, Joe.
Not easy fielding questions with a needle in your arm. All right, Mike Memoli. Mike, thanks so much.
Now, as booster shots roll out nationwide, there's still a push to get more Americans that first shot, especially as COVID hospitalizations remain high nationwide, with an average 85,000 people in the hospital right now. That's similar to what we saw during the winter. In Ohio, the number is growing fast. 2 months ago, 1 in 100 hospital patients were being treated for COVID. Get this, now it's 1 in 6, and many of the patients are much younger. NBC News Now correspondent Maura Barrett joins us from outside a hospital in Grove City, Ohio. Maura, good morning. So what are doctors seeing in terms of the ages of patients right now? I just mentioned they're getting younger. What are they dealing with?
Well, Savannah, doctors are hoping that these younger patients are feeling the effects of what they're hoping is the peak of their surge of the Delta variant here in Ohio. I want you to look at these numbers, though, compared to the last major surge that we saw here in Ohio back in December. When you look at the difference in case rates and hospitalization rates among 30-year-olds, there's a 185% increase there. And then when you scale up to 40-year-olds, it's more than 200%. And among 50-year-olds, back around 125% increase. So more than doubling, sometimes even more than that, of these younger patients getting sick enough to be hospitalized. And the things that doctors pointed out to me is it's not just necessarily people with comorbidities like obesity or asthma, which it is affecting, but it's also these younger patients as well. And here in Ohio, the resistance they're seeing to vaccines at about a 50% vaccination rate statewide, doctors say, is because of the spread of misinformation and the resistance against mandates like the one that President Biden was just talking about.
Now, Maura, I know you spoke with a woman in her 40s who spent nearly 2 weeks in the hospital with COVID. What did she tell you about her experience?
Right, I spoke with Heather. She's 44, a mother of 3, and she says that other than mild asthma, she's relatively healthy. She has to keep up with her kids, and so she was really shocked, even though she is unvaccinated, that she got as sick as she did. She found out she was positive at the beginning of September and then spent 12 days in the hospital. We spoke with her via Zoom because she's still at home recovering and even had trouble with shortness of breath in our short conversation. But I want you to hear directly from her about her experience in the hospital.
Like, if I'm being honest, I was scared that I wasn't going to come home. And, so I had like a million thoughts running through my brain, like what's going to happen to my kids was my And they were probably my main focus the whole time I was there. It was just, making sure I come home to them.
So Heather saying that she's so scared that she wasn't thinking she was even going to be able to make it home. And yet when I asked her how she's feeling about getting the vaccine now, she's still hesitant. She says that she thinks everyone has a right to a personal choice, and she doesn't want anyone to be forcing certain medical procedures on people. And so that's a lot of what doctors are up against here. And they're working on working with the state to make sure that any incentives like the new lottery that they're working towards with younger students and scholarships for schools to make sure that these younger populations get vaccinated is really key here. But it's all about the fact that a lot of people are reading misinformation on social media and aren't able to consult with their doctors directly if they have questions like Heather does.
Yeah, and Maura, so how are doctors feeling about that type of vaccine hesitancy? And specifically, I wonder, what's their message to younger people who still haven't been vaccinated and maybe either are seeing that misinformation on social media or just think, I'm younger, so I'd probably be fine even if I got COVID?
Well, that's the big thing that they're working to educate against, because with the Delta variant, and they predict with future variants, it is going to affect younger and healthier people. And so when we spoke with infectious disease doctors, they emphasize that having a vaccine, even after the variants mutate and get stronger, this layer of protection will at least protect younger people at least a little bit. I want you to hear a little bit from one doctor we spoke to about this.
We all have a date with this virus. This virus is not going away. And for people who don't have any immunity, unless you're going to live in a bubble, you're going to come in contact with this virus somewhere. And you really need to think about what layer of protection do you want to have when you come in contact with this virus for the first time. Clearly, the safest layer of protection you have is to get vaccinated.
This doctor also noting that we're going to get through all the letters of the Greek alphabet when it comes to variants. And so he's hoping that this kind of conversation with doctors and any younger people who have questions can hopefully ease any of their concerns, because like he said, everyone's going to encounter this virus at some point. And so it's important to stay protected even among younger patients. Savannah.
All right, Maura, thank you so much.
Now to breaking news in the race to get kids vaccinated. Pfizer has just submitted data to the FDA on its vaccine trial in kids age 5 to 11. Pfizer says younger kids will get a smaller dose of the vaccine. The company says it plans to apply for emergency use authorization in the coming weeks. Let's bring in Dr. Amish Adalja, senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. So, Dr. Adalja, let's start there with that breaking news. So what does this step in the process mean now that Pfizer is submitting data? When do you think younger kids might actually be able to get vaccinated?
It's still likely to be several weeks. Probably the most optimistic estimate might be around Halloween or the early days of November, if everything goes perfectly. Remember, they're going to have to do this whole committee process where the outside advisors to the FDA meet and discuss all that data. Then the FDA will have to issue an emergency use authorization, and then the CDC ACIP committee will meet to actually officially issue a recommendation. So that's probably going to take us to late October at the earliest. But I think it's good news, and I think it's one step for children reclaiming their lives.
Let's talk about vaccine mandates for adults. Late yesterday, a judge said New York City can move forward with its vaccine mandate for teachers and school staff. Those educators now have until this Friday to get their first dose or risk being suspended. What would you like to see other school districts around the country do? Should they follow New York's lead?
They definitely should. I think that if you're going to be a school teacher, if you're going to be working at a school, I think it really is important to have vaccination be a condition of employment, not just for teachers, but for all staff. And I think schools should start considering it for some of their students as well, because what we want is in-person schooling to go on unabated. We don't want people back stuck in virtual learning. And the best way to do that, the best tool you have, is to have as highly a vaccinated student and faculty population as possible. That's the armor that you can use in your school to make it resilient to a pandemic that's still going on outside your doors. And I think this is something that more schools have to think about.
And Dr. Adalja, let's talk about boosters. We saw President Biden get his booster yesterday. There's still, though, a lot of confusion about who should get a third dose first. What do you want to hear from federal health officials to help clear up any confusion about boosters?
this is a very confusing issue for most in the general public. What I think the federal officials need to do is really make it clear that the data and the efficacy of the booster is really proven for those people who are above the age of 65 and those who have high-risk conditions. That's where the ACIP committee was really resoundingly in favor of boosters. When it comes to healthy people, even if they might have occupational exposure, that was that controversial recommendation that was not voted on, was voted down by the ACIP committee, but then reinstated by the CDC director. That's a little bit different. I think that's confusing people. So elderly people, people with high-risk conditions for severe COVID, that's who we want to see getting boosters as soon as possible. Other groups, I think that there's less value to it because it's not really going to protect them against severe disease because they're so low risk for severe disease to begin with. But I do think this was another example of the CDC and the White House really mixing up messages and making it very difficult for the public to know what to do.
All right, Dr. Amos Shadolja, appreciate all your expertise on these important issues. Thanks so much.
It's a critical week for the Biden administration on Capitol Hill with major legislation at stake and the threat of a government shutdown. Speaker Nancy Pelosi faces the monumental task of whipping votes for the president's trillion-dollar infrastructure bill, as well as the even bigger social and climate spending bill.
Down the hall last night, Senate Republicans stonewalled a bill that would fund the government and stave off a default in U.S. debt. As if lawmakers weren't busy enough this week, the Senate Armed Services Committee has called top military brass to testify about the withdrawal from Afghanistan and former President Trump's last days in office.
Here to walk us through the whirlwind week, NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale and NBC News Pentagon and National Security correspondent Courtney Cubie. Good morning to both of you. Ali, I'll start with you. So Speaker Pelosi has a major uphill battle this week within her own party, and now Democrats were slated to vote yesterday on infrastructure but moved that to Thursday. So, Ali, I mean, do we think the Speaker has the votes?
Right now, it still doesn't look like it, and it's significant that we feel that way, especially because of something that happened overnight. Last night in a caucus meeting with her fellow Democrats, Speaker Pelosi said that the House can no longer wait on the infrastructure bill, the traditional infrastructure bill, because of where things are with the larger bill in the Senate. That reconciliation package had been linked previously in the mindset of leadership and in the mindset of progressive members of the Democratic caucus. They wanted to move forward on what they continue to call a two-track process. But Speaker Pelosi, citing the fact that we don't even really know where Democrats in the Senate are on the price tag for that reconciliation bill, she now says that they cannot wait any longer on voting on the bipartisan infrastructure bill. That makes that Thursday voting day look a little bit more solid than it was even yesterday when Joe and I were talking about this. The thing that still remains, though, is the hurdle that she has to overcome with progressives in her caucus. Immediately after we heard this news from our sources inside that caucus meeting, we saw Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, the head of the Progressive Caucus, go on our colleague Rachel Maddow's show and talk about how progressives still seem ready to potentially vote down this bipartisan infrastructure bill in the name of the larger social spending bill. It's always been a balancing act for Speaker Pelosi, but certainly she's been through these kinds of battles before. This one, though, very, very high stakes. Going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, and Ali, as if this week isn't intense enough, oh yeah, the government is careening toward a potential shutdown Thursday night. The Senate GOP just blocked a bill to raise the debt ceiling and are trying to avert the shutdown. What happens next there?
Well, and the reason that that failed is because those two things were coupled, the funding of the government as well as raising the debt ceiling. Republicans, led by Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, have said they don't want to join with Democrats to raise the debt ceiling. They would like them to do that through a budget measure that would be entirely partisan. The politics of that, they're pretty evident. McConnell would like to put that price tag on them in the upcoming midterm elections. At the same time, though, guys, it's important to remember there's a lot of deadlines floating around this week. There are the ones that are pretty arbitrary that Congress can sort of move around a little bit. Mostly those are on the infrastructure front. But in terms of funding the government, Thursday at midnight, the government shuts down. That's not just a question of the lights go off in government buildings. I covered the last shutdown. There's a lot of financial pain that's put on regular Americans who are trying to do the right thing, pay their bills, go to work. When they can't do that, those are the people that suffer during a government shutdown. Democrats have said they don't want to go there. They do have control of the House and the Senate. It's likely what we see is they move forward on a clean continuing resolution, so a clean bill that would fund the government. That's probably coming in the next few days, but certainly government agencies have been warned a shutdown could be coming.
All right, let's bring in Courtney here while Congress dukes it out over President Biden's economic agenda. The Senate Armed Services Committee is turning up the heat, getting ready to grill the military's top leaders on the Afghanistan withdrawal. What can we expect on that today?
Yeah, that's right, Joe. So, I mean, there's going to be two main lines of questioning that I'm going to be paying attention to at this hearing today. The first is on Afghanistan, and there is a lot to cover there. We expect that this is Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Mark Milley, and the CENTCOM Commander General Frank McKenzie. We expect them to get some tough questions on the deadly late August drone strike in Kabul that killed 10 civilians. We found out about a week or two after the strike itself that they had in fact hit the wrong target, killed a humanitarian aid worker and 9 other civilians, including a number of children. They will get some tough questions on that. They will also get questions on the chaotic nature of the withdrawal itself. So we should expect Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to defend the overall withdrawal effort and call it a logistical feat and praise that feat, in fact, but acknowledge that the first several days of it were difficult and messy. The second big line of questioning that we expect here is on the Woodward book. This is the first time we'll hear from Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Mark Milley on camera to address some of the allegations that are laid out in that book, Joe.
And Courtney, there's also that investigation into the January 6th insurrection, the events around that. General Mark Milley is going to be on the Hill testifying as well. What is he expected to face?
Yeah, that's right. So we don't anticipate that he's going to get a ton of questions on January 6th, just because there's so many other things to talk about in this hearing today. But we do expect that he'll get questions about his time as chairman for President Trump, and specifically about that Woodward book. So two things in specific, in particular. One is this phone call that he had with his Chinese counterpart in January of this year, where he allegedly talked about the U.S. being stable. He said that the U.S. was not planning any kind of an attack. And the thing that I think people will really hone in on, particularly Republicans, was General Milley allegedly telling his Chinese counterpart that he would let him know before the U.S. was going to strike. We'll hear General Milley's side of that story today. The other is this nuclear process meeting that he convened also during the transition from President Trump to President Biden. He will get some tough questions. We anticipate some tough questions on that as well, and allegations that he was trying to circumvent the process, the civilian leadership of the military, by holding that meeting. He will defend his role in both of those, Savannah.
All right, Courtney and Allie, thank you both so much. Let's now get a check on your morning news now weather.
Bill Cairns is with us. Bill, good morning.
Hey, Bill.
Hey, good morning. It's a pretty quiet Tuesday, but we're going to see isolated areas of concern, one of them being in the mid-Atlantic region. We haven't had a lot of rain after a beautiful weekend. It was a beautiful Monday, but now it's an umbrella day. If you're heading out the door early this morning from D.C. to Philly to New York, Hartford, Boston, everywhere in between, have that umbrella handy. It's been raining pretty good this morning from Pittsburgh, just south of State College, southern Pennsylvania, and all of this is going to head through Philly and New York about mid to late morning, and then there'll be another round of showers and storms after that. So you can see there's even a couple of lightning strikes mixed in there too, so a couple of rumbles of thunder early today. Now later this afternoon into the early evening, as new storms form, some of them could be on the isolated strong side. That area of yellow is a slight risk of severe weather today from Baltimore to D.C., Atlantic City. Of course, highly populated areas. 11 million are at risk, but not everyone's going to see these storms. As I said, they will be scattered. So as we pause this at noon today, that first batch of rain is exiting Boston and Cape Cod, and then if you watch, new showers and storms will develop from New York all the way down to Philly and Baltimore. By about 7 p.m., they're south of D.C., so for the evening rush hour, they should be popping up right over your head in Philly, Baltimore, D.C., southwards down towards Richmond and Fredericksburg, and then they'll be gone by the time we get to about 10 p.m., heading down towards Richmond in the Norfolk area. So with today's forecast, we don't want to forget how unusually hot it is. It's like summer never ended in the middle of the country. 90s today, not only in Texas and Oklahoma, but all the way up through Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, and the Dakotas. Still very warm. It's a rainy day in the Pacific Northwest, and that cool weather tomorrow in the Northeast and in the Northwest. We're not quite as hot in the middle of the country, but still pretty warm. So take your pick. We got rainy weather in the Northwest, hot in the middle of the country, and a couple thunderstorms for you in the Mid-Atlantic.
A little bit of everything, a potpourri. All right.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.